All right, welcome back, my friends, to Final Fantasy VIII. I always have to get that right these days. Episode 6 of this particular side quest. And back with me is my perennial friend, perennial party member, can't grayed out, cannot change, or switch member, or change junctioning, or anything, Wes Shantz. Good to see you, Wes. How are you doing?
Great. Good to see you too. How's it going?
It's going well, and I think we have a nice slice of game to talk about today because we did have some interesting elements of getting to play cards, learning a little bit about switching members and junctioning, and I do want to talk about that sort of liminal space, that interesting breaking of the fourth wall that is necessary in video games when they need to give you a tutorial in order to teach you a game mechanic, or when a side quest like playing cards interacts in an interesting and essential way with the mise en scène, the actual game itself. And as you've brought up before, one can actually learn a GF ability to change enemies into cards,
Mm.
which can help one to acquire more powerful cards, which can be necessary if one doesn't start playing the card game late until later in the game, because one's cards are then sort of under leveled compared to one's opponent's cards. And then as a conceit of the game, when you lose, lose your best card that you play with, which means that you just get weaker and weaker the more that you lose. Really, I can't even afford to lose once now because my freak card is far and away my best card, and it gets taken away. Some interesting things to talk about today. Also, I seem to recall that we've gone through our second dream sequence with Laguna and Ward and Kiros. Though
Yes.
Ward may not be speaking too much after this, his throat got injured. And we finally made it to Galbadia guarded, and I had a chance to make it to the capital city dealing of Galbadia, where we once accompanied Laguna and met
Yes.
and met Julia, his then, perhaps still now, love interest. But so,
Yeah.
my friend, what would you like to dig into today?
I guess we could start with the dream sequence. It's in liminal space, although it's not a vehicle this time, and we're not underwater. We're in a forest. Um, Now, normally in the overworld, you kind of just pass through forests, and there's kind of like a little visual indication of where your character is, like under the trees, you know. Um, but in this case, when you enter the forest, it actually becomes a scene, and you can see the path running through. So that's the image, I guess, of the travel that goes with this one is that path through the woods, right? And it's an old growth forest, and there's kind of palm trees and ferns and things. You can imagine, powerful monsters living here, and indeed they do. But you don't face any of those enemies yet. You just fall asleep, right? You have a little bit of dialogue with the party, right? They're still on this issue of whether Zell has doomed Balam Garden to invasion by the powerful Galbadian army, right? And he's like, "Oh, but there's seeds in the garden. We'll be okay." Um, you know, our man Squall is not the most reassuring. He's just kind of logically stating that it's a bad situation no matter what. And Renoa kind of scolds him for this, right? Like says basically part of being a leader is to look out for your team. Um, and we see some of his thought bubbles going on, like we do from time to time. Um, but what struck me is that once we do go into the dream sequence this time, unless I'm forgetting, um, we don't see any of the thought bubbles of the people who are dreaming. We just are kind of in the characters of Laguna, Kiros, and Ward. Um,
Quistis's first time, or at least in terms of the party that
yeah,
it was Quistis's first time. So us, and she shared that she had a question for afterwards. She's like, "What is this?" Uh,
yeah,
Zell was left out and did not fall asleep alongside of Renoa. And so, interestingly, they just kind of watched us in real time. So I don't know how much time passed, whether it was like a Cave of Montesinos issue from Don Quixote, where it was like
mm,
30 minutes out in the regular world and days in the dream world, or what. But sequences like that are odd, particularly when there are characters that do not experience them themselves, who experience something different. And so Zell was with us in the first one, but now is not with us in the next one. And so now Quistis is further implicated. So, and then there were four, as it were. So Squall, Selphie, Zell, and Quistis all are afflicted with, well, we don't know what it is yet, right? There could be some weapon that's being used on us, something in the air, some sort of magic, maybe something implanted by Balam Garden itself, or something being abused, or like if there is something implanted in us by Balam Garden, perhaps it is being hacked in some way by this Galbadian garden that we've heard is going to serve, or this new sorceress ambassador for the Galbadian president, who is supposed to bring about peace, intends to use the Galbadian garden as her base of operations. And in fact, this is just a smokescreen. Very interesting how this can reflect modern developments. But I mean, you know, geopolitical issues are a huge part of our day and age right now in 2025, in this world, but also a huge part of what's going on in Renoa, Squall, and all the crews world in Final Fantasy VIII. I mean, this is very much a nationalist and insurrection and fighting against the powers that be sort of game. Very, very similar to Final Fantasy VII and VI in that respect, I would say. But I've gotten away from what I wanted to say about sleep, which is sleep as a device for moving the plot forward is very interesting and ancient. In particular, I'm thinking of Dante in his Purgatorio, where while the pilgrim is asleep for the first time in Purgatory, he's literally moved by an angel to the front gate of Terrace 1 from this itself liminal space, while himself in a liminal space, dreaming, right? And his dream in some way reflects his reality. He dreams of being Ganymede and being picked up by an eagle, but and perhaps that is a symbolic representation of the fact that he is literally picked up by an angel and moved from one place to another, illustrating that physical space still exists in the Purgatorio in a way that it doesn't in the Paradiso. We are beyond the physical there. But this is something that also happens in Final Fantasy VII to good effect. Before when one is caught in Shinra, one falls asleep in these cells, and then the most horrifying scene of the entire game ensues right after, where there's blood smeared all over the floors and walls. It's horrifying. You're like, oh my, oh my goodness, what am I facing here? Yeah. But then also right before the very sad spoilers, death of Aerith, like you have to fall asleep in the Forgotten City. You have to choose to go to sleep. And then when you wake up, it's game time. But so it's interesting that Final Fantasy VIII has chosen to put characters to sleep against the player's will. We're not choosing to go to sleep, right? Like it just happens to us. We're passive. And then we learned something about 17 years ago, which we don't know our relationship to now, though we are going to a place where those characters have been now. And in fact, Squall thinks, is Laguna here? Interesting question for him to ask. But so sleep is being used not only in order to cause the next sequence to occur, but in order to help the plot unfold in a way that is, as of yet, undefined, or we're unclear in. Since we don't know the shape of the entirety of the planet, we don't really know what's unfolding. It's like we have these pieces of the puzzle, but we don't know what the puzzle looks like yet. So we're not exactly sure what we're looking at. But I wanted to mention, to your point of going into this forest, interacting in it in a different way. Instead of being in the overworld, we're taken into a space where we just passively have to receive the fact that we're falling asleep, going into this dream. And now we're dealing with this very interesting artwork and these Esthar soldiers. I guess one thing I wanted to ask about the dream sequences to you is, it seems like the level of difficulty is scaled down in those. And I wonder if that's because the characters that we're playing as are themselves supposed to be average soldiers, but they are empowered by our presence in such a way as to then become sort of superpowered.
I'm
Um,
wondering, yeah, I'm curious about that too. And I wonder if it has to do with the fact that you can't save the game, during these scenes. You kind of have to like play them all the way through, which was a thing back when save points were important in games, right? It's not so much anymore when you just have kind of save states and everything. But but yeah, I wonder if that was a decision that was made from more of a like story standpoint. Like these are soldiers who don't have any particular abilities, except that they do, of course, right? They have ours. Uh, and then maybe it's just from a design standpoint too, right? Like it's just to let the player get through these a little bit easier, not get stuck in them, not get frustrated with them. Let's make sure that all the battles are, minimum of difficulty here, as much as they look really cool, right? Because the Esthar soldiers, as Laguna points out, have those flashy uniforms, right? Uh,
the whole area is pretty flashy.
yeah,
It's lined with these very rich, beautiful, bright like colors, green and some pinks and blues. It really does set up, from what I recall, what the art style will be like in certain areas later. Like I'm thinking of the Ragnarok, certain
uh-huh.
areas there, and maybe even Esthar itself. There's instead of having the sort of technologically rich, futuristic feel, all of a sudden there's more of an impressionist feel to
Yeah,
the artwork, and not exactly. And I guess it's a nature scene in that it's sort of a cave network, but it's one of these rich, magical sorts of caves. It's a sort of cave that looks like it would be full of materia in Final Fantasy.
yeah, it looks exactly like a giant materia that we're walking around inside of. It's been tunneled out and some kind of excavation dig. It's unclear whether they're mining minerals or whether they're searching for artifacts here. It's some sort of industrial thing with all these pipes and tubes and machinery. Um, and we're on patrol there, right? That's the purpose of being here. But Laguna has a bad feeling about it, right? This is not an ordinary place for them to patrol, and it's not. Um, it's not his spider sense is going off. It's not good as far as he's concerned.
And they barely make it out of there with their lives. I think two of your characters, Kiros and Ward, get hit with what, soul suck, something like that, soul strike,
Soul Crush.
soul crush, and
Yes.
down to 1 HP. Nice little foreshadowing of the final boss fight, by the way, and the final
Um,
form of the final boss fight. I think I'm remembering that right. That she has a move that takes everybody down to 1 HP. And sort of
it's kind of a trade-off though, because the limit breaks in this game, you can keep doing them as long as you're in that critical right range, and I think they even become stronger for most characters the lower your HP is, or the less of a fraction of your total, right, a proportion of your total HP. So it's kind of like, I mean, yeah, they can die more easily, but if you can win fights so quickly as a result of being able to do limit breaks right off the bat every single battle, yeah, I don't know. So yeah, it definitely that definitely has a story purpose, right? Like there's a lot of stuff going on as you explore. You can like booby trap little hatches and you can roll boulders, but there's this one fight at the end, and at the beginning too. I guess there's a couple fights then that are inescapable. You can't avoid, and they have some sort of story function to them, right? The Esthar soldiers appear, they chase you into this place, and you're running around and trying to get out. And when you do get out, these slightly more powerful Esthar soldiers make an appearance, and the final attack that the one does, yeah, brings down basically Laguna saves their life, right? It becomes this kind of like uh, you know, kind of comical, right? Because he like chucks them into the water. But also there's a kind of uh, I don't know, you feel for him, right? His friends are near death. He doesn't know if they're going to survive. And he is doing everything he can to get them out of this situation. Very much in the vein of a Vietnam War movie or something like, we're not going to leave you behind, buddy. You're going to make it, that kind of feel to it. So,
that's interesting, and further entrenching the fact that we're following somebody that is heroic in some ways. He's sort of a comic hero in that he throws them into the water
yeah.
while himself being in rough shape, and you're like, are they going to survive the fall? Is he going to be able to get them out of the water? I hope they don't sink. And
Yeah.
especially because he seems to want to climb down and then he bumblingly falls off.
Mhm.
But I think any intelligent player, especially if they've played Final Fantasy VII, and if by this point in history they played Final Fantasy IX too, where it is in fact the kingdom of Dagger Garnet who's in your party that is the imperialist threat. It's her mother, the queen, that's going to find any intelligent player at this point, particularly with Squall's personality, the fact that you're a mercenary, the fact that you're ordered not to go beyond, not to do anything more than the contract suggests, and Seifer is even kept from being a seed because of that fact.
Mhm.
You've got to be wondering whether you're the good guy or not,
Yes.
and whether you are in fact on the good team. You know that you're not the most powerful player in the game. That's the Galbadian nation who's invaded Timber and also has another holding that we've just learned about as well, and is soon also seems to have access to the sorceress and soon Galbadian garden. So, but who are you and what role are you playing in this? Is starting. It has got to be a big question. And now you know that there's yet another nation and contingent of people. Apparently, the Galbadians, they're not just Galbadia and the Balam people and the Timber people, but there's this Esthar, sort of futuristic looking people who you get to listen to cool techno music while fighting them. I think that is just the Laguna like dream sequence music, but their fight music is really cool. Um,
Yes.
but so now one wonders, okay, now that we've seen Dealing City after having seen it first in the Laguna flashback vision dream thing, I don't know, time compression or time travel is
Yeah.
seen in the past. The, though we can't confirm that yet. It seems like now soon we're going to learn about these Esthar people if our path continues to follow Laguna's path in some way or another. Not to mention the fact that we are in fact actually introduced to a new character here too, this Irving Canisius,
Ah, right.
Caneus, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
I They don't have voice acting yet in this game, so I'm not sure. I'll have to look at it a couple times and then see what people say. Um, but yeah, so I guess that's just a reiteration of the question of what is the relationship between these dream sequence traveling through time, drug induced, or what acts of violence against the seeds that then make them hallucinate some past time or alternate reality, and why do we connect to that through sleep? Um,
Right.
and yeah.
There, so there is something kind of conspicuous about the draw points that appear in the exploration. You can find sleep. You can't miss sleep. The draw point for sleep is like right in your path, right? And then there's a confuse one down there somewhere. Um, so I do feel like there is something funky going on, that it's the game is drawing your attention to this fact, right? And it's made a point about sleep magic earlier too, where it's like if you're about to fight one of the T-Rex monsters in the training center, right? That's why Quistis teaches you about status junctioning. And she's like, hey, a really easy way to get through these tougher enemies is if you can get them to go to sleep or use, by extension, other status ailments against them. So there's something about sleep that allows weaker humans to defeat stronger monsters, right? There's that. It is kind of iconic as a spell or enchantment, right? It puts you to sleep. There's the Sleeping Beauty thing with Renoa when we first meet her in the train. Um, and as you said, it's got a lot of literary references that kind of, fairy tales or myths or legends. Um, there's something about heroes going to sleep um, in order to progress on their journeys. There's things that are outside of our control that are kind of represented in that unconscious state, right? That sort of bubble up as a result. And and yeah, Squall does not explain it at all to Quistis. Like he had um, you know, obviously been curious about this. He had wanted to ask Garden about it, right? That was something he mentioned at one time. But events have kind of pushed them forward now, and so the leisure to really get to the bottom of what's going on also seems to be a thing that is not on the table right now. This is like a deeper mystery. Right now, we have some immediate, stuff that we have to deal with. And sure enough, as soon as you get into the garden, which is right after the little pass that the forest blocks, um, Quistis leaves the party briefly. She's like, "I'll handle this." So she's not really dwelling on it either, as much as she probably should, since she and whoever else is in your party, right? Selfie, they come back with 1 HP. So it's like what happens in the dream world it affects them, obviously. And things that you do in the dream world, of course, like meddling with the hatches and rolling the boulders, all this stuff, is going to impact what you can access in the present day, so to speak, of the game, right? So there's clearly some sort of weird mystical thing happening. It's obviously supposed to make us think about our connection to these characters in the game, I think. Um, but in what way? I don't think we have enough data just yet to say exactly. But I like your point about, understanding what sort of hero Laguna is versus what sort of hero Squall is versus what sort of person we are, right? I think that is probably close to the heart of what these little sequences are for.
And the more intelligent one plays this game, the better the demon familiar is, which is helping
Mm,
one out. Which
yes.
that's something we definitely need to talk about. How much better you? I mean, this is how much better you are at this game. This is something we experienced in Final Fantasy VII too. But that is something I should admit, and I'm going to make one last point about dreams and sleep before putting everybody to sleep.
Okay.
Is that well? Let me just make that point really quickly. Something interesting about this sleep conceit here is that usually, so if you think about what sleep is becoming unconscious for a certain amount of time. So to be asleep is to be missing what is happening in the world. It's like you turn off for a little bit of time and things continue to happen um, outside of your range of consciousness. However, when these characters are asleep, and I guess another way to look at sleep is that it's not simply that you're missing what's happening in the objective or external world, it's that you are now seeing and are capable of focusing on what's in the internal world through the medium of a dream. And so not everybody dreams all the time or remembers their dreams, but it's something that one is far more capable of doing while one is asleep than while one is awake, daydreaming. And so in this game, rather than the characters who are asleep missing things, it's actually the characters who are awake who have to wait for the sleeping characters to return to consciousness in order to learn what happened and then to move the plot forward. The plot, in fact, waits on the sleepers, which is why I think it's convenient when they are in liminal spaces like a train, which moves regardless of whether they're awake or not. But there's an interesting comment seemingly being made about the meaningfulness of sleep and dreams and how a dream can not just relate to one and when it relates to one, but how it can actually affect one's life. And so there's an importance being attached to what happens while these people are asleep and in this sort of dream world that makes the dream world, it pairs it or gives it parity in terms of importance to the sort of external overworld or regular world, Squall's world rather than Laguna's world. And that following your reasoning about parallels between Squall and Laguna and the player and Squall is an interesting comment about the value of play and of playing this game. Because insofar as playing this game is sort of becoming unconscious of what's happening in our external world in order to then focus on this sort of dream world, the claim of the game seems to be that the things we do within this game, and I think this is amazing, will have an effect on our own existence and our own world. And so, and this is the sort of claim you would expect from a piece of art talking about its own genre. But the claim seems to be that you, in perhaps embodying a better character, a character that is better than you in some way or another, perhaps morally, definitely skill-wise, definitely in terms of magic. I'm not a great magician. and use of the gunblade, which doesn't really exist in our reality, such as a prop. Um, that could in so well, we don't know what the relationship between Squall and Laguna is yet, but then in some way that relationship or what happens between them could happen between Squall and me or Squall and the player. That the video game, that the story, the piece of art, in being focused on and given our time and energy, could have some sort of positive, transformative effect, not just in its own world, but in ours, perhaps through us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think all of that is probably lost on 99% of players, right? It was certainly not in my mind when I played this game the first time, right? And so there's something about um, approaching the game with the right mindset or like openness to consider things that is requisite here. And so I find it kind of funny that all these characters, right, are treating the dream sequences as this kind of um, you know, obstruction when of course Selfie at least is pretty aware that like Sir Laguna is really she's like really concerned with his story, right? She really wants to know what's going to happen to him. But the others all seem to think this is this like a weird thing. Yeah, we should probably be worried about it. Um, yeah, yeah. So the audience's perspective um, is gonna impact a lot of what you get from this too. Um,
And it's a
yeah,
strange thing to deal with at the very beginning of the game, that these characters are passing out of nowhere, and there's a rotating cast of who pass out, and we're now following an episodic but somewhat linear narrative of this other character that we're now, uh, or at least one of the characters in our party is following raptly, or with rapt attention, and suggesting that we should perhaps be taking an interest in this too. But I think also just suggesting that this is a weird world, even for a Final Fantasy world, and one doesn't learn the sort of structure of these worlds or all that's possible until really the end of each game. And they do take on, they do have sort of different metaphysical spaces and capabilities within them. There are, there are some consistencies, but we really don't know the nature of this world, and it seems to be a pretty bizarre world. So again, touching back on one of my old hypotheses, one of the things I think that could be a barrier to somebody's enjoyment of this game is it's taking so long to unfold. It
yeah,
still has not unfolded. We're almost now to the end of disc one, which I think the very next mission we go on when we get to Dealing City and have to do our thing against the sorceress is right where it all
yeah,
ends. We wake up in prison. We go from this moment of, well, great action to a moment of tremendous inaction, and we'll have to think about that. Um,
cool.
but we still don't know what's really going on. There's some momentum picking up. It seems like there's a sorceress
No, no.
and she's misrepresenting her role to people, but everybody seems to understand what's actually going on. And
Yeah,
or at least around the garden that we're at, this new garden, this Galbadian garden. And so it's a tricky, difficult, weird world. It's hard to put one's teeth into it.
hmm
So yes, I wish to reiterate that, but also to ask you, because there are a couple big things that happened in this playing that we haven't gotten to. Is, well, first and foremost, what did you think of this second garden, this Galbadian garden that we've seen?
Yeah, I mean it's really cool as you enter. You see these kind of like flying dudes come
Yes.
around. They have like mechs apparently.
Yeah.
That's new and kind of fun. It is kind of like the machine that we fought in Delling City, right? That giant mechanical thing that kept chasing us around. But these ones are smaller. They're humanoid, much more like a Xenogears kind of deal, or something along those lines. You can't interact with them at all. They just fly away. Everyone there seems very like athletic. You
Yeah.
know, there's a lot of people doing push-ups in the hallway. There's a haste draw point, so something that speeds up your movement. They have like courts outside that look like you could play something. They have a skating rink inside. So there's also people though. There's people in wheelchairs moving around. Um, so there's, in short, like an emphasis on the body, right? There's like very muscular people. There's very short people. There's differently abled people, and they all seem to be much more serious, right? Than Balam Garden was kind of light, kind of chill. The music here is kind of intense and almost like
Drums.
noir-ish, you know, there's something mysterious going on. Um, it's a little shady, you know, it's like a little more run down almost as futuristic as some elements of it are. Um, and yeah, and as soon as you go in, it starts to like ping you with like, hey, that that group from Balam Garden, you need to go to the reception room. And no one's like making you go there, but they also don't let you explore everything. There's like parts of the campus that are off limits to guests, apparently. Um, so as much as you can kind of walk around and talk to everybody, play cards with them, draw their magic, whatever. Um, there's clearly more here than what we can do at this point. Um, although it is significantly smaller, I think, than Balam Garden, right? Uh, yeah, and the angles of the camera are like very dramatic in certain places, especially once you get into the scene where it's reported back that, you know, Quistis finds out that A, Galbadia is not going to attack Balaam, but B, they pinned it all on Seifer, and most likely he has been executed summarily
Oh,
as a result. Yeah,
executed, and there's our first character death. He's not really a party member, but we did get to have him
briefly.
in our party.
Yeah.
But I mean, you do get to have Sephiroth in your party too at one point during the
Mhm,
course of Final Fantasy VII in a replay sequence, or excuse me, a flashback sequence.
mhm.
But he's not under your control then, and the same way that Seifer is. But yes, there's a bombshell dropped. Oh my goodness, Seifer. We see these kids finally seeing the weight of the consequences of their way of life and their decisions.
Yeah.
Seifer has now paid the ultimate cost for attempting to help Renoa, who he was helping because he thought Sid made an incorrect choice and sent an incorrect amount of people with the incorrect amount of skill. So as much as one might just want to say, well, it was smart to follow orders and to become a seed, and Seifer's made all of these mistakes. I wouldn't be able to help but feel that I were a little responsible. Obviously, he made his own choices, and fate and choices, like we talked about last time in great depth, are a major theme in this game, and even in a game itself, where even the choices you make are prescripted to some, or prescribed for to some extent, and even the ways you can go. And you know, it's a very interesting question how much freedom one has to act within a game against compared to how much one just goes with the flow, or is pushed by the current. Is even freedom in the game itself an illusion? But we see Squall hearing how typically people talk about his dead rival. I liked him. I hated him. Perhaps hurting him even more. Renoa saying, "I think I might have been in love with him, and we might have even been together." And so Squall says, "I won't have it. I won't be relegated to the past tense,"
Exactly.
which
Yeah.
I think is a mixture of his feelings of sort of jealousy at Renoa liking Seifer, but also his feelings sort of implicated in Seifer's death. He chose this different path from Seifer, obviously, but in some ways it ends in the same way.
Yeah.
And this is the thing I just wanted to harp on, because as a young person, I really liked that I'm not going to be relegated to the past tense. That's a paraphrase.
Yeah.
I won't be confined to the past tense. But I'd say one of the greatest lessons of this game is the fact of death.
Yes.
And so generally what one has to take from, say, Aerith dying in Final Fantasy VII is that Sephiroth is wrong to pursue immortality, and that death is a natural part of life. And Kefka was wrong to pursue becoming a god. And that Aristotle is right that you would not give up the nature of your being or the sort of being you are, even to be a god, because what would you do? But Squall seems to, and I guess unfortunately, a sort of typical fashion with him, take the wrong message from the death of Seifer. He doesn't want to be confined to the past tense. I mean, so what does that mean to you exactly? To me, that I understand. I guess I could understand that in a life affirming way, where he's like, I'm going to live, but trying to just deny death, that that does not strike me as an intelligent way to attempt to be a mercenary in this world where, Seifer may have been his best friend, given how friendly Squall is, and he died for doing what he thought was right, as foolhardy as it was. And so, yeah,
So yeah, I mean, what we see from Squall, he cares so much about his agency, as we've pointed out, and he can't trust other people, right? He thinks it's foolish to do so. And what we're seeing here, I think, is him noticing that, oh, there's like a very distinct point at which I will no longer be in charge of myself, and all that will remain of me is whatever I've been able to hand off and connect with in terms of relationships with others, right? And so the thought of himself being in the past tense, the way that he phrases that, at least in the translation, is really striking, right? Given all of this stuff about time so far too. Um, the fact that he is kind of in the past tense already because he's got this weird thing that happens where he goes back in time and does stuff and is, connected to somebody who's we'll find out how they're related, but is responsible for him in a very significant way, right? And so exactly the thing he's like most afraid of and like cannot abide um, being the case, right? So he's got a significant moment of crisis here that is partly about his friend dying, but mostly it seems like about what it means for him to kind of come to grips with mortality and how how he's going to deal with that. It, and like immediately after this, we also get a really interesting new character introduced who is a yet another kind of alter ego for Squall, a very carefree and very skilled marksman, right? Who is added to the party specifically to do this job that isn't like directly stated right away, but it's like Squall looks at the contract, he's like, oh, none of us have that skill. It's like, oh, don't worry. Here's Irving laying in the grass, his finger pointing like a gun, and just like lets the butterfly like lightly land on it. It's very evocative of his personality, I guess. He's just kind of doing his own thing. Very stylish, like all the characters, but he's got kind of a cowboy thing going on. And and the first thing that he does, right, is like have Renoa on the one arm and Selfie on the other, and it's like, hey, how's this for a party? And you can be like, all right, it's fine. And if you do, the two girls will like fawn all over him and like try to make Squall jealous, like out of how callous he is to not seem to care that they would go with this guy, right? Not show any manifest jealousy. And then Quistis plays along too. As soon as they leave, she like starts to like claim Squall. And so it's really funny actually. This comedic thing probably doesn't fit very well with the fact that we just learned that our friend has been executed. But on the other hand, Seifer's two friends also appear right away, right? Fuji and Raijin, they are like, that's ridiculous. Like he would not go out that way. And so they just completely dismiss it, right? So a very different approach to to death, right? You have your denial, you have your make light of things and just enjoy life kind of carpe diem thing going on, right? And then you have Squall, who's like deeply affected, right? And is angry and doesn't know how to deal with his emotions. So it's a really cool like back to back to back treatments of this off-screen thing that happened or supposedly happened. I find it, I mean, this like some of the good stuff right here so far in this game, I would say, in this playthrough.
very Greek tragic to have a messenger speech, as it were, and to have
Mm-hmm.
action off screen. But that's something I wanted to touch on. So you brought up this perennial theme that we've been touching on, or yeah, really uh, mulling over, of control and Squall's relationship to control and the numbers of controls on him, whether they be orders. Now we have new orders, and in fact, they come from two different sources, right? Galbadia Garden and
Yeah.
Balam Garden, and and the goal is to basically save the world now, but in a very different way from saving the world later. It's not that it will so much be destroyed like from a laser beam from space or a comet or something like, or a meteor for that case, but that one country will tyrannize over the rest. But that's a really interesting point that you make about his lack of control over how he was generated in its first place. So that you've just touched on the poles of one's existence, right?
Yeah.
One does not have control over coming into existence. That is one's parents' sort of decision and job to bring about. And one also doesn't have control, and this is a very Iliadic point I thought you made, over what is said of one after one dies, one's kleos. Or, the honor that one has acquired during one's life is basically the insubstantial shade of one that remains after one's death. And so he has this sort of agnostic, pagan view of death, which perhaps is life affirming in that he realizes, oh my gosh, I've got to live so much in the present that I still seem present even when I'm past. But I see him bucking again against a new control that he sees on his life. It's as if he has finally realized that in dying, I no longer have control over what people say of me. I hope they don't just say these general things about me, like they're saying about Seifer. I better make something of myself. And
Yeah.
that makes me wonder whether part of the comment of this game and part of why it takes itself so long to unfold, because we are, of course, embodying students, is that part of developing agency in the world is understanding and realizing all of the controls on one and on one's behavior. And insofar as, and sort of a Spinoza's ethics way, insofar as one understands the amount of controls on one, one is more capable of being free and acting freely, because one doesn't have illusions about what one is capable of, in this world. And he's struggling with these realizations. He is not taking them lying down. We see some emotion finally out of Squall. We're seeing some growth being pushed onto him, because the nature of these realizations bring him to, I think, a more consistent, or they're going to bring him to more generalized views about the relationships that he should have with people. Because I think when he realizes all of the controls on himself, he's going to realize that one thing that gives people strength are relationships with others, particularly when they are, fighters, like he is. His relationships to other fighters will empower him, not weaken him. This is the problem with Seifer. This is the problem with Sephiroth. These characters act alone, and particularly in a bellicose universe, that is imposing a tremendous control on one. That one, if one just worked with others, well, one might have more agency within the world if one relied on others, like Squall did, not like Kefka, not like Sephiroth, not like Seifer. And I just want to put a tangent to talk about that soon. The same way that there's a strange relationship between who's in control with Genova and Sephiroth, though I think the Ultimania finally said that Sephiroth overpowered her will, which is amazing. There's sort of a confusion about who's in control between Idea and the president too.
Yes.
And this sort of sorceress, representation of unconscious forces, feminine, dark, extremely long, legendary hair with this sort of red protruding mask that looks like one of those old
Plague Doctor
masks.
Yeah,
Exactly
yeah.
right. And right. And then this a very official president who wears a suit and tie in this futuristic universe. Where is the real power there? Who's making the decisions? Is it this sort of secular world on the surface, or this sort of strange, unconscious, mythic world that we're getting touches of through these dream sequences and the presence of this sorceress, and hearing that her political power is increasing. But yeah. So sorry.
I just want to point out, like, in terms of her powers, she, it seems, can brainwash people or at least manipulate them very effectively. But the sort of like scope of that seems to be limited, right? If she's passing um, herself off as the ambassador, she seems to need some sort of political mechanism as well as this like magical enchantment one that she's already got going with at least one or two people. So it's really interesting to think, just to like say, politics is essentially like an amplifier for brainwashing and manipulation. Like, seems to be the message of the game at this stage.
Use TV as well,
Yeah.
right? Use media
Yes.
they use it
These media.
to
Uh-huh.
broadcast a maximum amount of people. I mean, if this game had been made today, they wouldn't have to have that plot point. Each character would have a cell phone.
Right.
They would be able to access that. But they,
Right.
who could have known that that would have been the way that technology would move? We were thinking hover cars. But okay, so I want to return to a point you made about contrast and similarities in Galbadian Garden and how physical it seems to be, like the Durmstrang of the Final Fantasy world, right? So yeah, we see these like tennis, basketball courts. It's sort of undefined, but they look like those. We see people doing push-ups. There are a lot of military people around. When we first come there, there's a drum theme. So like a waltz, that's very militaristic. The drum is a military instrument, like the bugle, and or the horn,
Yeah.
and then we meet this very contrasting lover boy Don Juan figure who looks a little bit like he might be Sephiroth, right? He's got a trench coat, he's got riding boots on, he's a little more Texas looking than Sephiroth, who's a little bit more Third Reich looking with his long black trench coat, more Hugo Boss looking, and and but he's like kind of gentle. He has this butterfly touch him, and he's a ladies' man. He likes the ladies, so he's not Sephiroth. He smiles. He is a loner in that he's a sharpshooter, but that's more of seemingly a smokescreen, more of what he says to people, says to girls to have them find him attractive. It's unclear to what extent he is, in fact, a loner who can callously, coldly assassinate somebody. He doesn't seem like an assassin. Sephiroth was a good assassin. I knew he would kill you, and he showed it. Irving or Irvin, I'm not sure about him, and I do find him a very nice foil. He's so personable, but perhaps very fake too. He's obviously hiding a core of what might be some sort of tremendous insecurity. Though it may also be the case that Squall is hiding that, and it may have also been the case that Seifer was hiding that too, because he exuded confidence to Renoa, but it may have been bluster. But the person who introduces Irving is interesting in that he is the representative figure of Galbadia, and he is not a hunched over sweater vest wearing kindly guy that needs to be corrected by staff. He is a tall, straight backed guy named Martine. Martine, like Mars, right? The name literally comes from the planet that represents conflict and fighting. Mars, Ares, god of fighting. And so even reflected in the name of the head of this garden is the more bellicose nature of this, the more physical nature of this place. And then they give us Irving. And so my question to you is he like how he is? Because snipers are always kind of weird and different from the people that they're around, is the idea. I have a friend, an old friend from St. John's who was a sniper, but he came from a differing sniping school from a lot of snipers, and said that they always treated him like he was an outsider. Is that, or is it the case that they're giving the worst student slash seed at this garden to Squall and company because they know he'll fail, and part of the orders are then for Squall and this ragtag group of young seeds and this failed instructor to attack this ambassador head on, who will have somehow survived this. And so I could also see this as these individuals who have messed up and put Garden on the radar being sent to their deaths. This is a setup, basically. What I mean, how do you read the situation? What do you think?
It does seem kind of preposterous that I mean, to this point, we've seen how weak guns are relative to other weaponry.
That's a weak shot.
He's the weakest thing. Yeah. Yeah. So why that should be able to take out the sorceress who to this point is one of the more powerful characters we've seen doesn't make a lot of sense, right? Now that's okay. Like we can live with that for the purposes of a story. And it does seem pretty plausible also given that we haven't actually directly spoken to people involved, right? We're getting this from messengers, we're getting this from someone we don't fully know or trust, except Quistis says she's dealt with them before, right? But she's also kind of a her true loyalties are a little unclear. So yeah, there's definitely at least a whiff of cloak and dagger, like maybe we should be suspicious of this. And Squall does not, for whatever reason, pick up on that at this point, right? He's not mistrusting. He's just saying, okay, this is the contract. I'm gonna do it, and we'll find out, I guess.
I mean, truly, at this point, what choice does he have? There are significant control, like we've been talking about. Quistis is there. 2 Gardens have commanded him. He's sort of on the run in some way. I still wouldn't be confident were I any of those characters that we weren't in big trouble, given that they were on TV in front of the entire world with the president in front of them. Now, luckily for them, they came out looking more like characters trying to save the day, though they didn't save the day. And Seifer was blamed, but they, well, yeah, so where can Squall turn? It seems the only place he could have gone is to Galbadia Garden. They're not just going back to their own garden, which would be very nice at this point, and in order to just regroup, they're being sent back into the field. They have no direct line to their own garden, too, by the way. This is all mitigated through Martine. Supposedly, Fujin and Raijin brought a message from Sid to Martine, and then that was given to Squall. But who knows what could have happened to that message and on the way there. Not to mention the fact that Fujin and Raijin as messengers are interesting choices. I'm not aware whether they're seeds or not.
I don't think they are. I think they're kind of lackeys, right? And they're just like, oh yeah, we'll just like go get Seifer, right? Like now that we've dispatched with this this message quest thing, we're scot-free, I guess. Whereas now we have 2 missions, right? We haven't finished the first mission that we got because Timber's still very much under the Galbadian control. And now there's this supervening mission of okay, but also go do this impossible task real quick, right? Take out the sorcerers.
Right. And where that mission has come from and whether it is in fact we have no options. We're in Martine's garden and have potentially and really upset the interests of our own garden. It's unclear what our relationship even is to our home, and whether we're in trouble there too. So in trouble with the Galbadian government, in trouble with our own garden, having all of this mitigated by this more warlike sort of unwelcoming garden.
Mhm.
That we so Squall, even if he does have inklings that this is a trap or a way to get rid of them, I think has extremely limited options at this moment. And that may also be part of why he's being hit by the situation that Seifer found himself in. He knows that Seifer found himself in a situation with very few options,
Mhm.
and then one option, and then no options, and perhaps Squall feels the noose tightening around his own throat to some extent, even though he has taken the safer or the more regulated or the seemingly better path through life so far, or at least through the past several incidents. Um, what one thing I did want to this is just changing gears for a second to talk about the messengers, Fujin and Raijin. Something interesting that I think that the story designers and the character designers and the dialogue designers do in Final Fantasy is dialect work, particularly in translation. So Final Fantasy VII, you have the only sort of African American character, though obviously America is not an actual country in Final Fantasy VII World, Barrett, and he speaks a very distinct dialect. He swears constantly, and then also you have this older Caucasian guy, Sid, who is also pretty vulgar. But with these two characters, they both have interesting linguistic sort of tics. Fujin only speaks in one word in all capital letters, so she apparently just yells. And then Raijin um, sort of looks like he's like the predecessor of Waka from Final Fantasy X. He's shirtless, has these overlarge pants, which are actually in style in Final Fantasy in 1999 Jinkos. Um, but he says like um, at the end of each time he makes a statement. And so I was wondering what you did with these distinct ways of speaking, that these two characters that are friends to Seifer and also on the disciplinary committee. Why is it that they speak in such distinct ways? Is this supposed to point them out as potential antagonists in the same way that often animators will animate antagonists with physical flaws, like say Scar from The Lion King is not only darker than Mufasa, but he has a scar, a physical scar on his face, or even casting decisions in makeup. So the first Daniel Craig James Bond, the antagonist is a character with a blind eye that weeps blood. Um,
Yeah.
and so is this in a world where most characters are beautiful, though not all of them, and we'll soon see some like Norg, my goodness, who are not. Why are they demarcated linguistically in this way? I guess is my question.
Well, My my guess, although I'm not sure about, I take it to be an attempt on the localizer's part to render something going on in the Japanese text. And I do know that in Japan there's, very distinct dialects that all carry some sort of connotation, especially in terms of pop culture, like when they make an appearance. So something akin to our like use a southern accent when you want someone who's like very genteel, or on the other hand, use a slightly different sort of southern accent when you want someone who's kind of like a hillbilly, right? And so it like conveys certain things. So I assume that that's something like that is what's going on here. Um, and I think it's sort of part of the world building, right? Of the whole increasing diversity of types of characters that are modeled in these games. And yeah, you point out Barrett, has a kind of racial background that's I think new to the series at that point, at least for like a major character. And Kiros does too, right? Like Kiros is visibly darker in skin tone, has very distinctive features, and so does Ward, right? He looks like a giant of some kind. They like physically very distinct, and for the the art style and the design elements of these games, that sort of distinctiveness has always been a hallmark, and they sort of represent it in different ways, right? Like in earlier games, it's the sprite work on the the character classes, right? So that a dragoon looks really different from a white mage or whatever, right? And you can tell at a glance like what they are. There's sort of a symbolic element there. And then as the technology gets better and it goes to the level of like the individual, face or stature, appearance, all those are things that seem to be like happening visually, and then this is a way to like have that happen textually slash vocally, right? Because Final Fantasy X is going to pioneer the use of actual um, voice acting in these games, but they're sort of like clearly on the way to that, and they're increasing the texture of the world by trying to bring that across, right? And I think in the course of Final Fantasy VII to VIII, there's a leap in the level of like attention paid to, and probably money paid to actually too, like the localization process, right? The text translation process. Um, that's something that Final Fantasy VII has, of course, lots of typos and sloppiness to it, and things that are just inaccurate. And I'm sure VIII does too. There's that one about the forests of timber sure has changed, right? It's like these kind of memeable moments. So they didn't like catch everything, but it looks like they're doing more and better at getting some of that sort of flavor across. That's my
I think
impression.
I think that's very good. One thing I would like to maybe parse out, not necessarily this time, but soon we will have the opportunity, I think, to see Fujin and Raijin up close and personal again.
Yeah.
But to look at Cypher or Seifer and his party, as it were, like Seifer, uh, and so there are different ways to constellate this, but I'll do it like this for now, as in Seifer, Fujin, Raijin, and perhaps like the mutable character, female sort of leader is Idea.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, and this may not yet be right, we got Squall, Selphie, Zell, and then this sort of mutable female leader character is sort of Quistis at the moment, but there's also Renoa. So, but they don't have to be perfect parallels so much as what does Squall's how do the characters within Squall's party act as foils to him? How do the characters within Seifer's party, more important to this iteration of the question, um, relate to him or act as foils to him, or do they show psychic elements that he needs to integrate into himself? Are all of these partial representations of a person themselves supposed to add up to a person, or is there something? Are there supposed to be defects in each of these characters that show what is defective in the whole? Because soon we'll see that Seifer is alive and is rejoined to his friends, and they're on the wrong side. They're on the antagonistic side, and we will fight Fujin and Raijin together, but not with Seifer. And so, again, like we talked about last time, we're seeing these differing paths for moving through the time in this world.
Yeah.
And so, and there are in some ways more and more parallels. Seifer is taking his party into himself and is taking a more and more autonomous or road less traveled way through this world. But also, even though we're like, I don't know, the good guys who are on track, we're really off track at this point.
Yes.
We're, like you said, doubled up on missions. We have nested missions now, which are of both seemingly epic for mammoth difficulty. And it's very unclear what we know the next place to go, but like our larger path forward is very much unclear to us. But I say all of that just to make one point about Fujin, which is that she has gray hair, which is itself indication of basically nothing in Final Fantasy, because there are Sephiroth has gray hair. There are often characters with gray hair. Setzer in Final Fantasy VI. And sometimes that means they're like the dispassionate, non-emotional character. But she's gray hair and she speaks in one emphatic word at a time, which I just thought suggested that she, like perhaps Squall, is somebody who was traumatized as a child and is being represented as a traumatized person. And if she in fact is, two ways to interpret that in relation to Seifer is that another thing about him that he does better than Squall is that he takes injured people into himself. He took Renoa's cause to himself. He took Fujinin, even though she's weird, different from other people, not normal, or doesn't. She's different. She's a differently abled individual. She has gone through different experiences. She manifests herself in a way that is distinct from those around. And one wonders whether Rajan himself just is not very intelligent because of how he speaks. And so because of these sort of normatively speaking, deficiencies in these characters, they were not going to be seed material. One's not smart enough, and one can't communicate especially effectively. And these might have been characteristics that kept them from ever becoming seeds, in the same way that Seifer's insubordination kept him from becoming a seed. And so I just wonder whether Seifer connects to these people in the same way that the Joker in The Dark Knight connects to schizophrenics, because he is himself flawed and mentally disturbed, and people flock to him because of that, or because Seifer in fact has some kindness in him, and takes these two sort of losers under his wing and gives them a friendship group.
Yeah, the parallel that comes to my mind is the Turks in Final Fantasy VII, right? There's this kind of paramilitary, hitman group that, is also like in the pay of Shinra, and yet is somehow separate from them, right? And so they always seemed like the kind of foil to Avalanche in that game, and I think even more so in this one, because actually Seifer and Squall are directly rivals, and they seem to be sort of the yin and yang of one another in some way. It would be really interesting to see some fan fiction or some modded version of the game where you play as Seifer, right, and you see things from his point of view and get a little bit under his skin of like, yeah, is he more of a compassionate sort of character who appears to be a kind of a bully, but in fact is looking out for people who no one else uh, will give the time of day, right? And that's pretty interesting, actually.
That's part of the not black and white Final Fantasy, I think,
Yeah.
genre, how it subverts the seemingly obviousness of what is dark and what is light. Like there are elements of that, but it again is a very much unclear whether he has been in the wrong under certain criteria so far, but by certain emotional, sort of personal, ethical criteria, trying to act to help his girlfriend, one can see how that can get one in trouble. I mean, Romeo and Juliet, but at the Iliad, for example, Helen of Troy and such. But that's not wrong at every level. There are just perhaps mistakes that he made, and that I think is a much tougher thing to grapple with. The notion that a lot of people teach Greek tragedy, and they say that there's the fatal flaw, the hamartia of a character, and I think, well, that's a very psychologically easy way to engage with these characters, to suggest that Oedipus is just arrogant. Look at that arrogant guy, and then you think about current political figures, and it just all makes sense to you. And it's like, that is unsophisticated thinking. That's naive thinking. The fatal flaw, a hamartia, is just missing the mark, like missing an arrow shot. It's making a mistake. It might just be that a character makes a single mistake. Maybe it's a series of mistakes based on a temperamental aspect that we later define as a character flaw. But it might also just be that this person makes a mistake at one point and maybe another, and that's it.
It's funny you should bring up missing the mark, right? Given this mission that we're about to.
That's funny. That's very funny, right? And what the implications of simply missing once can be. And I think that's a much harder lesson to learn. It's not that you just in general are such and such a person in such a way that you can see what the future is clearly. I mean, maybe if you live in certain ways, like you smoke 7 packs of cigarettes a day. you probably have some inkling to how it's going to end if 18-wheeler still hits you. But the idea that just a mistake could define your life, and not one that you even understood the implications of from the get-go, I think that's something that Cypher is dealing with right now, but also Squall through seeing Cypher. Cypher is directly dealing with it because his life has just gone crazy. But maybe he has more control over it now because of the presence of the sorceress in his life. And we'll have to see. But right, I think Squall now has to deal with the fact that whatever, it's not necessarily that you do something wrong that might get you killed. It's in chasing what you think is right. In chasing what you think is right, and everybody else says, well, you did it in the wrong way afterwards, that might get you. And I think that might be part of his issue with the past tense and of becoming historical, that not only can less than you think lead to your end, but then nobody around you will interpret what you were doing correctly either. And that, especially for a young person, I think is about the worst thing you can imagine. I mean, if you're going to commit suicide to shatter the lives of the people around you, you want them to understand why you're doing it. They just all don't understand it, and it doesn't have the impact. Then you did this thing for nothing. You made this ultimate mistake, as it were, for nothing. And on a different end, was all of this fighting to try and do good that Seifer did actually him just making wrong decisions, doing bad, and then being ultimately misunderstood after he's dead and can't correct any of these people's opinions? And is that the measure of a life?
Yeah, it's a great scene. I mean, I think it is pretty incredible how you have these 3D, characters moving in this kind of tableau, almost like they're on stage, and the camera moves around to see, different angles on what's going on. And Renoa, right, is in this kind of reverie almost about like how she fell in love with Seifer. They had these nice memories, right? And so there's that too, right? Even a positive memory uh, is in this case a kind of pity or a feeling that Squall does not want someone else to have towards him. Ostensibly, he would feel, um, made lesser in some way if someone spoke about him like that, right? Um, and so it's a weird kind of twist of romantic jealousy, um, that that particular piece of it, right? And then there's the comic relief right after that of her being like, hey, just pretend I'm a seed, it'll make things simpler. And so she's like trying to do the almost like you do in Final Fantasy VII when you're trying to be a soldier in the parade and you have to like do the moves. She's like sort of doing that, like seeing what everyone else is doing and then like Addie, so it's
My wife was watching me, and I was like, no, notice that, and she's like, I'm already watching you do a pretty nerdy thing. I'm not going to look for the details. Just seeing that and appreciating that, that she was trying to follow like that. Well, speaking of following, it seems like we've gotten to the end of this particular dream sequence on this side quest. We've conquered this level, Wes, and it's time for us to move on to the next one. I thank you again for another wonderful foray into mythical and mystical worlds.
Yeah.
And hopefully, like we discussed today, it has some effect on the world around us, perhaps even a positive one. To those listeners listening, if it's within 50 years from us doing this, please like, subscribe, comment. As usual, you can find Wes. Wes, where can they find you? Just because you know the details better than I do.
Yeah, videogameacademia.org and obviously the podcast Bookworm Games, of course.
Yes, wonderful. And do you have a one of your wonderful newsletters coming out today or tomorrow? And can people subscribe to that through videoacademy.org?
I think if they go to the website, they can do that. And yeah, I didn't get to one last week either, so I hope I get to it this weekend. Yeah, I'm
Okay.
working on something, but we'll
Okay,
see.
you're working hard today. You're working hard today. Well, I always look forward to those, and I'm sure our listeners do too. And well, until our next side quest, my friend, I'm gonna have to save the game at the save point here, and then
Okay,
up the system again in a week.
sounds good. Take care.